So this afternoon we are going to start with thinking about measurement and evaluation and study designs for dissemination and implementation science. Fortunately, I have a very easy job. First of all, I have only a few slides, and many of the slides were actually covered with previous conversations, so I will be able to breeze through those. We will use the same format of having these wonderful panel members here answer a couple of questions from me, and then open it up for discussion. You all had great questions, so please keep bringing those to us. So when we think about the difference between traditional efficacy or effectiveness research, and this is kind of, you have seen it in multiple variations between Russ's slides and Brian's slides. The traditional efficacy research might ask, does this program, intervention, treatment work under optimal conditions? And that's a very traditional question that we try to answer. When we move into the realm of closer to the D&I stage, then we might ask a question, when, where, how, with whom, under what circumstances, and why does this program work? Or we even ask something like, what methods or strategies are effective under what circumstances to disseminate and or implement this program and intervention? And so when we contrast these two types of questions, the one in black and the two red ones, we kind of realize that we need to think about alternative study designs in many cases. And also when we plan our measurement efforts, we have to consider the complexity of these questions. So in terms of study designs, I just wanted to point you again to the colleagues at the Washington University in St. Louis. In that toolkit I presented to you earlier, there is also an evaluation design toolkit where they guide you through these flow charts, and this is just one of them, kind of decision tree, to decide what type of designs you might want to consider. And they include all those alternative designs that are more common in dissemination and implementation research, as well as some of the more traditional ones. If you want a really comprehensive review of this topic, a recent publication, and you can see that this was, part of it is Greg and Larry on it, was published on overview of existing evaluation designs for dissemination and implementation research. We do not have time. This could be a 2-day conference just in itself to talk about design options. So we don't have time for that, but this paper really gives you all the options and categorizes them, so a good place to go. And then one thing that we have not talked about too much yet, I believe, didn't even mention it, is hybrid designs. And I'm surprised because people usually heard about hybrid designs and they have a lot of questions. Basically, these are linkage between clinical effectiveness trials and implementation research. And this is your way of creating intervention or evaluation studies where you consider both effectiveness and implementation outcomes to varying degrees. So in hybrid 1, your primary outcome is still the effectiveness outcome, but you already start to collect some feasibility, etc., information about implementation potential. In hybrid 2, there is equal weight to both the effectiveness and the implementation component. And in hybrid 3, the main outcome is your implementation outcome, but you still gather some effectiveness data. And so this is a design that has been very widely used within the VA, but also outside the VA, to create studies where you are able to focus both on the effectiveness component and the implementation component. There are great studies, examples out there published. You can find those. The original article is Curran and colleagues. And again, I really recommend this because I think this can be a helpful way of thinking through where you are at. And then thinking about implementation science outcomes, again, just contrasting it with more traditional effectiveness and efficacy trials. If we think about the usual pathways between the evidence-based intervention and patient outcomes, when we move into the implementation science realm, we also want to know how we can get those evidence-based interventions to improve patient outcomes, and these are implementation strategies. There are also implementation outcomes and service outcomes that should be considered. And some hardcore implementation scientists, at least one of them is on the panel, think that worrying about patient outcomes is not really the focus of implementation science. Our focus at the stage of implementation science is in the middle. And so I think that that's an important piece to keep in mind, that when you are identifying your measures, you might still include patient outcomes, but you do have to have those traditional implementation and service outcomes also considered and included. So where would you find measures for dissemination and implementation research? As it turns out, it's not that easy. We did a review, it was kind of an environmental scan, systematic review of the literature, not systematic, review of the literature, and looked at where could people identify existing D&I measures. And so we found 17 measure resources. So these are some form of repositories, whether it's a systematic review or an interactive repository of measures, where you can go and identify existing measures. In some cases, they provide metadata on measures, psychometric properties, what population they have been used, whether they are free or not. And so if you go into this publication, they are listed and you can use that. Two of them I will highlight. One is the Seattle Implementation Research Collaborative Instrument Review Project. They are actually almost done. They went through this process, Greg, was it a 10-year, 5-year, 5-year process. And they published these measures with various ratings and meta-information. The kind of bad news is that you have to become member of this society to have access to these. And this is a wonderful business model, obviously. That's why they are able to continue working on these measures. It is a wonderful society, actually, and they have biannual meetings for implementation science, so it's really worth becoming a member, and I don't remember, not that expensive. So I think most of us are actually members, and we attended the previous meeting. The next one is in 2019, September, and really recommend it. Again, the bonuses, you have access to all these measures and information. And many other things, they have other activities as well. And then the other one is a very different angle on measurement. So the first one I described was a traditional expert review and rating of measures. This one is a very innovative approach on NCI's part, the Grid-Enabled Measures Database. How many of you heard about the Grid-Enabled Measures Database, or GEM? Only one, wow, two. So the Grid-Enabled Measures Database is broader than D&I. It includes measures for various somewhat cancer-related outcomes, but of course they are very broad on their definition of cancer. And we created a D&I workspace there. So we have about, now I'm going to blank on this, 130 D&I measures uploaded, again with metadata. And we rely on other people to upload their own measures, and then others to rate and comment on measures. So two asks, one is a recommendation, go and check it out, whether it's the D&I section or the broader section. The ask is that if you have D&I measures or other measures, go ahead and upload them and provide metadata on them, because that's how this system grows. And there is a publication that we did on the process of going through this, creating the space. It was really a very different process. And then I will mention a couple of more important considerations. One is when you think about the contextual question I described for D&I research, it becomes obvious that the use of only quantitative measures is not sufficient. And so bringing in the qualitative side and thinking about how qualitative methods apply in implementation science. And I'm showing a few publications here, both for mixed methods and then qualitative. It's very important. We have a number of experts on the panel who are actually focusing in their work on figuring out how qualitative methods can be applied in the context of implementation science, and also mixed methods. So we will talk about that much more in a moment. And this is an initiative that Larry and Allison and myself are members of, thinking about creating guidelines for implementation science on how to use qualitative measures. And we can share with you more about it. It's not yet published, but it's going to come out soon, right? Good. And then one more resource on qualitative research. I was so excited to see this. I actually didn't know about it. Allison is part of the faculty for this event, and it looks like it's in a gorgeous setting. The program looked even more exciting, actually. So please check it out if you are interested in learning about qualitative methods. This looks like a great, quick place to gather information and get some close attention from great faculty. So I'm going to close my very brief overview and provision of resources by this slide that actually Russ already explained, which gives you a nice summary of how D&I science characteristics define what type of methods and measures we should be using. So you are very familiar with this slide. As I mentioned, we have a nice, big, and wonderful panel here. I would like to introduce you to all the members. Some of you have already met this morning. Dr. Greg Ahrens, Dr. Lauren Brookman-Frazee, Dr. Raz Glasgow, Dr. Alison Hamilton, and Dr. Larry Palinkas. And you can see their affiliation. And we are going to ask some questions, and then it's going to be open for you. Let me keep this up. So I'm going to use the same method of addressing a question to someone and then allow a couple of people to answer. We are also going to have questions coming from you or from me, limited to a few people, just so that we can kind of go through multiple questions. Lauren, I have a question for you. And this is a question about the reality of how evidence-based practices are being implemented in real world. We very often only talk about there's this one evidence-based practice and it's being implemented and it's in its own little world. But the truth is that there are usually multiple evidence-based practices being competing or being implemented in the same setting. So what happens in that case? What kind of methodologies or considerations you should take?
So the observational research that I'm involved in is characterizing the sustainment of multiple evidence-based practices that were implemented in the context of a system-driven, kind of fiscally driven implementation of multiple evidence-based practices in children's mental health services in LA County. And what we have found is that large systems often are driving the implementation of multiple practices. And the reason that there are multiple practices or interventions being delivered is because of the varying and complex needs of the patient population or the client population. So in children's mental health, there's a number of different problem targets, anxiety, depression, conduct problems, and then developmental levels. So we think about interventions for a 5-year-old may be very different than interventions for an 18-year-old. So to kind of cover the coverage of the interventions that are needed for large systems that are responsible for varied patient populations, often there are multiple evidence-based practices being needed and implemented. And some do target the same population. So then the context of routine care in some ways can be somewhat of a marketplace of EVPs. And so in the context of observational research, we're looking at, well, which of these interventions are sustained when they're supported and driven by a system, which ones are sustained and how? What are the determinants of sustainment? So our challenge is then, well, how do we define sustained delivery of multiple evidence-based practices? And so, you've heard multiple people talk about this today, but the multiple levels that something is implemented. So how many clients does that reach? How many therapists are delivering a practice? How many agencies are delivering a practice and within a system? And so, and then what does that look like? What's the quality of that implementation? And so we've had to use multiple measures in order to answer these questions. So in our context, administrative claims data are a very important indicator of sustainment over time. So in our context in LA County, therapists actually bill for specific practices. So we can look at over time what therapists are billing for. Now there are limitations in that because just because you say you're doing something does not necessarily mean that that's the practice that's being delivered. So then we kind of bring it down to the interaction between a therapist and a client and thinking about, well, how is this being delivered? So typically we think about that as fidelity. But when there's multiple practices, it becomes very, really impossible to measure fidelity when there's multiple practices. It's not pragmatic. And so our team has approached kind of looking at kind of pragmatic assessments of what we call EBP concordant care that would include elements of strategies a therapist would use or be expected to use for a given care target versus a name brand intervention. So that's how we've, and we're moving away from the observational methods that we use in efficacy and effectiveness research and looking at therapist report measures that we're, of course, trying to validate against observational measures. So that's really just a couple of the things that we think about when we're moving out of the context of just one EVP into multiples.
Very interesting. Anyone else had similar experience or something that you would like to share related to this? Well, I have another to me, very exciting question. And I will start with Alison answering that. I was wondering whether there were any challenges during your implementation activities that you didn't anticipate and how that impacted your study design and other types of measurement plans.
No, I've never had any challenges in implementation, none whatsoever. I think more challenges than anything else. I'll try to give a really brief example, a challenging hybrid type 2, to refer back to that terminology, study of a evidence-based HIV prevention intervention. Brian was involved in this study as well, where we were putting this evidence-based intervention into place in community-based organizations serving HIV-positive individuals and their HIV-negative partners. So it's important to note that the study was designed and funded about 6 years ago. So there's just been so much development in D&I since we put together our best effort at measuring and capturing what was going on in implementation. So we had measures, we used program change model, which at the time was one of the few models that had measures associated with it, validated measures associated with it, developed by Dwayne Simpson and colleagues at Texas Christian, just to go back to some of our themes of this morning. And we used the evidence-based practices attitude scale. We had a whole bunch of wonderful measures and qualitative data collection as well. So we felt like, we were kind of capturing the universe of what might happen in a diagnostic sense at baseline before implementation, and things were looking very good from these measures. We looked at burnout as well, so we had low burnout, great attitudes toward evidence-based practice, enthusiasm for the intervention, a desire to treat couples, lots of organizational buy-in, you name it, things were looking extremely good for implementation, and implementation was extremely difficult. And what we couldn't stick to our original design of a waitlist control design at the client level. And what we realized was that we had woefully underestimated the impact of external context on implementation. And, in hindsight, looking back and seeing, well, there really aren't that many measures of external context, or they might be a subscale of an organizational readiness measure or something like that. And so, we were looking at where we might have missed measurement opportunities, but also where there were gaps in the field in terms of measurement. And, just really tried to understand what happened, really got into a much deeper understanding of the vulnerability of these organizations, how permeable their walls are to all of the forces that are impacting them, especially in the area of HIV services, policy and politics, how vulnerable the clients were, and how that impacted their ability to participate in this intervention, despite a lot of interest in doing it, but so many competing priorities at the organizational and the client levels that affected implementation in really, really profound ways. So Russ, you mentioned the importance of telling the stories of things that don't go so well, which we have done, and in close partnership with our program officer as well, because there are really important lessons to learn when things don't go so well also. So we're just trying to really learn from the extreme adaptation that we had to engage in that study, and also to really think about how can we kind of push more into understanding external context and its impact on implementation. And just to go back to one of our other themes about using models and frameworks, what I did and my colleagues did in analyzing the data to understand this is we actually retroactively applied the CFR model because it has an external context domain. So we took each of the constructs within that and applied it, but that's not what we started with. So there are lots of kind of creative ways that you might want to use models and frameworks depending on what you're confronted with in your data and in what you learn throughout the course of implementation.
Very helpful. Any other panel members had implementation challenges? It sounded like no one else.
Well, I think it was very telling that when you asked that question, we were all laughing pretty quietly up here. But I just building on this external context issue, I mean, the loci study that I presented, I alluded to the policy shift in the state of California that's being adopted county by county that's really impacted kind of the demand characteristics and what both organizations at the executive level, middle management, and the counselors in the field really need to attend to and do. So we've included a measure of implementation overload in our measures now to try to get at the demands put on the organization through this policy change. And also in order to deal with that, we're doing our third cohort, we're recruiting in another state. So just to get out from under that policy shift, so we'll have at least one cohort that doesn't have that policy that we can contrast with the other cohorts. So we're recruiting in the Phoenix and Tucson area right now for our third cohort. And I think one of the lessons about this is you do have to be flexible in any study, but in implementation research, I think particularly so, that you can expect that things are not going to go as planned, and that there will be surprises along the way. And I often like to say when people are thinking about getting into implementation research, I said, implementation research is not for the faint of heart. Mm-hmm. There's the whole thing of getting funded, but then once you're funded, you really do need to be a problem solver through that process.
Well, I am going to contradict myself and ask whether there's anyone on the panel who would like to share experience with not so well done implementation. I know we already had 2 people, but this seems to be a good topic.
All right, I'll try 30 seconds, even though I promised I wouldn't do this. We had a project years ago, a smoking cessation project in Planned Parenthood clinics, where it started off being an enormous success. We trained, it was kind of the equivalent of LPNs that did the intervention anyway. We had a really good training, had really good results, and then the organizations that participated, I think we had 9, went through all sorts of downsizing, and the turnover was incredible. So we actually submitted a paper called The Never-Ended Training that we had. Our solution, and I don't know it was the best one, it certainly wasn't the only one, but was to create at each site kind of a master trainer who could carry it on, and that, as best we could tell, might be more likely to be there than a month. And then the second thing is we tried to put up, at that time, web-based things were relatively new, but some more systematized training materials that could be used for other people.
Thank you.
So my example dates back, I think, to 2008 to 2012. I was working on a project that involved the use of community development teams, sort of a quality improvement collaborative that was developed by the California Institute of Mental Health to see how effective an implementation strategy it would be in scaling up an evidence-based practice developed by Patty Chamberlain and her colleagues at the Oregon Social Learning Center, known as Treatment Foster Care Oregon. And this study involved working with county child welfare, child mental health, and juvenile justice systems in 40 California counties and 11 counties in Ohio. And there were 2 interesting findings that emerged from that. The overall impact of the study actually produced a very small effect size. The community development team approach, as opposed to how agencies normally contact a treatment developer and get trained in an evidence-based practice, wasn't that significantly greater, even though it accomplished many of its objectives in building networks, communicating or disseminating research evidence. So that was a null finding in general. There were some positive effects, but overall it was a null finding. The second was, as part of my role in that project, I looked at how agencies used research evidence in making decisions about whether or not to adopt treatment foster care organ. And I found that in general, mental health services agencies and juvenile justice agencies were more likely to use research evidence in making decisions than child welfare agencies. And I thought, what is it about child welfare agencies? You know, why are they disinclined to use research evidence in making decisions? Well, both of those findings were actually tied to something that was going on in the state of California at the time. And that was, those of you who were around in California at the time may recall, we had a debt of $24 billion, which meant that public services all took a big hit. Unfortunately, child welfare systems took a bigger hit than the other two systems because mental health had funding from the Mental Health Services Act, and juvenile justice had funding from a program known as MIOCR, the Mentally Ill Offender Criminal Reform Program, which provided supplemental funding to compensate for the loss of revenues from the state. So when we initiated this project, we couldn't have anticipated the budget shortfalls in the state that would have affected an implementation effort. But the consequences of that certainly came out in the results from the study.
Thank you so much. I would like to move on to thinking about measures for D&I. And Russ, I thought that I would target you with this question first and then open it up for the panel. Could you provide us with the characteristics and some good examples of validated measures for implementation outcomes?
Well, you caught me. I don't know if I can off the hand, so let me answer a different question. Then some will
That's what we agreed on, that I will ask something and he will say what he would like. So it's
I'm running for office starting next.
Unlike a politician.
Right. Well, first of all, I think where I would go was look to design this is something I was struck by that Ethan mentioned this morning, and was to think about a logic model in terms of answering your question. But I think it's critical to have a measure that really reflects the core constructs that you're trying to look at. I go either to what the two slides that you put up there, to CIRC or to GEM, to do that, to look at what's validated. I do think, and again, others may well disagree with me here, so I might get beat up, but I think the criteria for an ideal measure in implementation science might be a little different than what I was taught, the traditional psychometrics and things, growing up and being trained as a behavioral scientist. So I really try to look for pragmatic measures. So in addition to reliability and validity, I also look for things that are practical, that are brief, that are broadly applicable across different populations. And then, to me, the single most important thing, if I can only have one measure, is sensitivity to change. At least usually that's what we're looking for, is improvement. And frankly, I place a much higher value myself, and I'm a bit iconoclastic on this, than I do like great factor structure or internal consistency, whatever. I'll stop there.
Well, I am going to keep this question on the table because there might be different answers from other members of the panel. Anyone else on the characteristics of ideal measures for D&I? I think Greg has something to.
So I think for our program of research, we've had to develop some of our own, and I think that's the way some measures get developed. There's the matching of measures to your constructs, as Russ was talking about, that's critical, especially in your applications, but there may be some emergent constructs. So for example, this idea of implementation leadership that came up in some of our earlier work, we were kind of dissatisfied with general measures of leadership and didn't feel that they really captured, the characteristics of effective leader behavior for implementation. So we started developing those measures, with an existing funded project, and then we sought funding, got an R21 to further develop those measures of leadership, climate, and what we call implementation citizenship behavior. So what are employees doing to kind of go above and beyond in support of implementing and using specific evidence-based practice. We created those thinking about Russ's criteria for pragmatic measures as well. And so they're very brief, very good psychometrics. We have been actually tracking change related to the intervention, some of the data that I showed earlier. But we're also making them general. So where we might talk about, leadership for an evidence-based practice, if your study is implementing, so for example, Eric's cognitive behavioral social skills training is, my leader is knowledgeable about CBSST or motivational interviewing or cancer screening, whatever it happens to be, so that the measures can be adapted. And a lot of emails I get asking about those measures, some people are very tenuous and want permission to adapt the measures, and we make our measures public access, freely available. So, and hopefully give some guidance about that as well, so that the measures have high utility, adaptability for specific projects as well. And so I'd like to see more, as people do develop more construct-specific measures, to really kind of have those values.
Thank you. I do have a question for you, Greg. Actually, the next one was for you, so I will let you answer it first. When we went to this CIRC conference I mentioned to you last year, the theme was basically assessing pathways and mechanisms. That became a high priority in implementation science, to think about pathways and mechanisms and opening up the black box. So what are some approaches that we should take to address this need?
Yeah. So there's a move around the NIH to think about mechanisms of change. So it's not just enough to have an implementation strategy and then have your implementation outcome, strategy and fidelity, or strategy and reach. There are intervening variables, and we need to be clear about identifying those mechanisms. Typically, the other language is mediators or moderators, determinants and targets. So please use the language of whatever institute you're applying to so they know what you're talking about. But one of the ways to really address that is, I find really useful, is to draw the picture about those pathways and about what those relationships are. And they can be somewhat complex. You may have to simplify it for an application. You may know in the back of your head that, this may be a mediator in some cases, it may be a moderator in other cases. But the more you can understand what those potential relationships and the operation of those mechanisms are, is going to be critical. And then using the right approaches towards kind of shaping your trial, but also evaluating and analyzing your data. The one other thing I'd like to say about this is that Hendrix Brown and Marissa Sklar and I, with a few others, just published a paper on this idea of scaling out evidence-based practices. So different than scaling up. The question is, can we borrow strength from prior effectiveness trials to understand how an evidence-based intervention operates in a new setting with either a different service system, or if it's a similar service system with a different population. And the idea behind this is that you would look for similar mediational pathways. So would those mechanisms operate similarly in the new setting as in the old setting? And the idea is that you don't need to do a brand new randomized trial in every setting, because every system that I've worked in, people want to know, there could be a ton of evidence about the intervention. Does it work here? Does it work in my system, or does it work for my population? But if we can identify existing data, and often in someone's research program, you may already have those existing data. Do we need to do that full randomized trial, or can we really capitalize on just new data collection that'll increase power since we have a good comparison already. So, but again, the mediational or mechanistic pathways are key to that approach as well.
Thank you. Larry, how does mixed methods fit into this whole picture of D&I and thinking about designs and measuring these complex outcomes?
Well, I think certainly mixed methods plays a very important role with respect to the last question about understanding mechanisms, development of models and frameworks. Actually, the generation of theory, mixed methods plays a critical role. Because you oftentimes see people using qualitative approaches to constructing models and quantitative approaches to testing those models. And the fact that our understanding of the field is still largely guided by perhaps hundreds of different snapshots of the phenomena as opposed to one comprehensive representation of what implementation is all about, suggests that there still is an important role to play in that exploratory process. Whereas the quantitative methods are often used to confirm what it is that we've explored and what it is that we've learned from that process. The same thing is true with respect to the generation of measures. So as an illustration, I'm working on a project now similar to one that Lauren is doing on the conceptualizing and measuring sustainability or sustainment of evidence-based programs and practices. And that has involved using both qualitative and quantitative methods to get a sense about what stakeholders think of when they hear that word sustainability. What do program officers that fund these initiatives think about? What is it they want sustained, and what is it that they feel to be critical to sustaining those activities? And we've done semi-structured interviews, we've used checklists like the CFR, we've used techniques like QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, which is a hybrid qualitative, quantitative approach. We've been able to triangulate the results we get from that, plus a third approach known as free listing, which comes out of the old cognitive anthropology, cognitive psychology tradition, to identify critical domains to sustainability. But we've learned not just in terms of how you go about measuring it, whether you scale it, whether you apply the kinds of psychometric testing that Greg has used on many of his measures. But when we look at the term itself, are we talking about indicators of sustainability like Lauren has been using the administrative data, or requirements for? And the fact is that both in the literature and the way that people think about it and act towards it, there's a lot of confusion about whether sustainability is an outcome, is a process, a dependent or independent variable. And it's the ability to combine both the qualitative and the quantitative methods that enable us to make that determination. Which constructs tied to sustainability are predictors and which constructs are outcomes.
Thank you so much. I have so many follow-up questions, but I'm going to resist. And I'm going to open this up to the audience because I'm sure that you have your own examples and questions, and I want to give you enough time to ask those. So let's see, I saw Jesse here, and then Ming, and then we'll go from there.
Quick question for Russ. When you're talking about sensitivity change, are you talking about it in the context of traditional, like a true positive, where you can identify those with a characteristic versus a true negative? Is that what, in that context, or something different?
Two things, both that and then just simply the notion of sensitive to either change over time in response to an intervention, or better yet, even ability to differentiate between like a comparison condition and another one. And the reason I say that, and let's go back and forth because I may be missing the intent of your question, but so many measures that have great, like a lot of quality of life measures are just incredible. They're related to everything. They're beautiful measures, except for they're almost impervious to change, to interventions that we have. So I think, again, if behavior change, either at an organizational, provider, or patient level, citizen level, is important, that's an important criterion to use, because you can use a great sounding one, but if it's not sensitive to change, you're never going to, get an effect.
So what are the optimal measures for that, for sensitivity?
Microphone.
Well, it's just, you could do, one way would be look at different groups, known criterion groups, kind of criterion sensitivity, or again, this just over time sensitivity to an intervention where you do that. And again, ideally, it's differential sensitivity. One last thing, since I have the mic for a second, that I should have answered in response to Borsika's other one, but it's a good place to look for these measures too. In addition to the two sources, the CIRC and the GEM, the PROMISE measures that are funded by NIH, and increasingly are going to be more and more important. These are patient-reported, somebody can help me here, outcome measures. But the cool thing about them is they've developed by experts around the country in different areas. A lot of them are symptom or quality of life measures, but there's an increasing number of them. But they're used, at least the majority, using computer adaptive testing. So the beautiful thing about that is it meets my criteria for pragmatism, because they're based on like, hundreds of thousands of people sometimes answering longer scales, but what you can do, depending on the type of response, is narrow it down so there's just a very small number of items that are used. Today, I think this is of limited application because so few settings are set up to have that type of adaptive testing and immediate feedback, or particularly integration into the electronic health record. But going forward, I think I'm like really bullish. That's where you want to invest. Used to be plastics, now it's PROMISE measures in the future. So
I just want to follow up on Jesse's question also. So I'll take us back a step. So I think in terms of looking at the characteristics of measures, it's not just the mean level and change in mean level, but you can also look at things like, the confidence intervals. Are there measures that tend to have a lot of dispersion, so it's harder to find effects of change, for example? Or from the organizational literature, the degree to which a construct, if you have 30 team members reporting on the same construct, how much variability is there within that? So around organizational climate, they call it climate strength, right? You can have a mean level, but then if everybody on the team is consistent in reporting about that, that would be, you'd have a certain, say you had kind of a median climate average score, but you had a high climate strength because there was a lot of agreement that, yes, that is the climate of the team. So that's another kind of metric you can look at over time to see if that's changing.
Related to effect size?
Would it be related to effect size? Yeah, I mean, to the degree that the confidence interval is implicated in effect size, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to let Ming ask her question now.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is for Greg. I was very intrigued by by what you said about measuring the leaders' behavior towards implementation, so have you told them that you would measure their behavior?
Yes, we're very explicit about that, and we use from the kind of organizational approach a 360-degree assessment. So we have the leaders rate themselves, we have their supervisors in the organization rate them, and we have their staff rate them. We believe that the staff rating of the supervisor is the most valid. And we've done a couple studies looking at what they call perceptual distance or discrepancy in those ratings. And one where we looked at transformational leadership in relationship to organizational culture, and the greater the gap between the leader's self-rating and the staff rating of the leader, the more negative impacts on the organizational culture. When we looked specifically at implementation leadership and implementation climate, it was a little more complex, where we looked at two aspects of climate for implementation. One was involvement, the degree to which staff perceived a climate for involvement in services, and the other climate for receiving feedback on their performance. And where you had leaders who rated themselves lower and staff who rated them significantly higher, what you had was a more positive climate for both involvement and feedback. And in the literature, that's called the humble leader. So, right, someone who kind of underestimates their ability, but they're doing a good job based on others' reports of them. So there is a fair amount of nuance in there. And yeah, you know, having leaders get that feedback is sometimes can be emotional. I've had leaders where they rated themselves very highly and their staff rated them very low, and I would sit down with them in their office, and I had one leader like in tears, like I'm trying so hard, doing all these things, and I think my score reflects that. What they weren't doing was they weren't communicating their actions to their staff appropriately. So they were doing lots of things behind the scenes, but that wasn't being communicated to staff. And actually the best sort of feedback is where I have the leader and the staff in the room together, and then we can process that together. So there's kind of a clinical aspect to this as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to actually, you can have other questions and I will take those, but I have a question that I want to make sure we cover. And it's a question about using qualitative methods and how feasible it is to use them in the context of the VA or a busy healthcare system when they want answers immediately. And I know that, Alison, you did some amazing work on figuring out ways that you can still be rigorous, but you can actually be feasible in this context. Would you mind to tell us a little bit about that?
No, not at all. Well, since it's critical to have a qualitative dimension to your implementation evaluation, and yet we are more often than not pressed for time, pressed for answers in the VA, there's a particular emphasis not only on informing what's going on in implementation, but also getting answers to our policymakers, to our operations partners. And I can't say, well, I'll conduct interviews for the next month and then I'll tell you what I learned in 3 years. They're just not going to take too kindly to that. So, I mean, it's just really briefly, what we've tried to do is organize our qualitative data collection. First of all, to align as much as possible or expand on the quantitative data collection, but also to be manageable, feasible, targeted, and to have a pretty built-in system and structure for turning around results relatively quickly. So it is more on the deductive side of the spectrum in terms of your analytic approach, where we're really looking for more targeted answers about what's working, what's not working, what's getting in the way. It's not the deepest aspect of what you would ultimately want to do with your data, but it can help you kind of reduce the data to a manageable set of information that then can be turned around to the team, to the partners, to your stakeholders in many different ways. So we use a combination of matrix analysis. We develop summaries of every data collection episode that are fairly structured in nature. So we're looking at sort of a limited set of domains across our data collection efforts, summarizing those and turning around summaries very quickly to all the relevant partners. So we really had to develop it out of necessity because we needed this information, especially if it was going to inform what we do next with implementation, how we might need to change course with implementation strategies. And then one thing that we've added in our recent efforts, in addition to the usual semi-structured interviews that we would do, is a more consistent, my colleague Erin Finley, who developed this with me, we call it periodic reflections. We're trying for monthly reflections, we don't always get it monthly, so periodic reflections where we're doing sort of a limited inquiry into, of all the implementation strategies that we're trying to use, that we intend to use, what have we used lately, what's been more or less important, just kind of giving us a little bit more information on a regular basis using a guided discussion technique. And that's really enhanced our understanding of things because it's giving us more timely information more frequently. So we can talk more. I'm happy to talk more about that at breaks and stuff like that too.
Thank you so much. I am so excited about this piece because I realized it with my work with the VA that there is no way you can get the data turned around too quickly. It's just, they always want it sooner than you can. So this is one way to get at least closer to their deadline. And so we included, actually, I included reference to a presentation and then also the reflection sheet in your guide. If you are interested in it, you can kind of read up on it as well. Any other questions to anyone? We will get you the microphone.
Thank you. So in addition to the intended, expected, hoped for outcome of actually getting something implemented when you're making changes in a complex adaptive system, you're going to have unintended outcomes as well. Some of them positive, some of them negative. How are you measuring that and factoring that into your assessment of success?
Well, one consequence that one of the earlier studies that Greg and I did in Oklahoma looked at a potential unintended consequence of training people in an evidence-based practice which suddenly makes them more attractive to other agencies. So they leave and you now have to train and expend money to train somebody else in their place. So we looked at the issue of whether implementing evidence-based practices actually did result in turnover. We were able to explore that both qualitatively in our interviews as well as in the periodic surveys that Greg was administering. It turns out that that is a concern that many agencies face, and in fact there are a number of strategies which are designed to address that issue. Train the trainer approaches to ensuring that there is a constant resource within an agency, for example, is a strategy that has been widely used to ensure that the agency doesn't have to keep going back to a treatment developer to get new staff trained. There are a number of consequences like that emerge. So many times you might see, and I think our concern at the time was not so much employability, but the fact that people had been doing a particular way of delivering services for years, simply weren't interested in learning something new and would rather retire than go through the grueling process of being trained, retrained, and so forth. But there are a number of other impacts. So the ability to be compensated by insurance plans for a program that requires 12 weeks of therapy when the insurance plan only provides 4 weeks, or won't provide insurance for behavioral parent training when that's proven to be the most effective way of addressing a problem that a youth may present with. Part of the key to doing implementation research well is not only documenting the outcomes, but documenting the process. And that process is critical because that process enables you to understand the extent to which context influences outcome. It enables you to examine issues of generalizability. It enables you to document the kinds of adaptations that Lauren had mentioned this morning that are inevitable in any implementation effort. To simply focus on the outcomes themselves is necessary but not sufficient. You really have to understand and document the process as well.
You go. No, please.
I'll just add to piggyback on that. I think there are lots of unintended consequences, both positive and negative. And so, and some of what we found is a number of them have been quite positive, and that we hadn't built them into our measurement. And so then that flexibility that Greg talked about has been really important to potentially quickly add measure or indicators of some of our unintended consequences. The qualitative piece is critical to capture that process. But just as an example of a positive unintended consequence, I'm doing a trial of it's an adapted version of Greg's leadership intervention. And, our measurement is primarily measures of implementation climate and implementation leadership, but we found some intermediate process impacts that we hadn't necessarily expected, is that those are early indicators, show that the programs where the leaderships were in their leadership training, that their leaders and supervisors are much more engaged in the clinical intervention training, and we hadn't captured that. And so we've kind of quickly, I'm looking at some of my team here, who's quickly adapted our data capturing so that we're now tracking, okay, well, how many leaders are now participating in our clinical intervention training? We hadn't really anticipated that would be an outcome, and had focused on our measures of climate and leadership. And so that's kind of that quick, pragmatic and flexible approach to capturing when you find something new is happening that you hadn't necessarily intended. And there's many, many examples that happen. And sometimes we can't do that, but it comes up in our qualitative interviews.
Wonderful. Russ, did you want to make a very quick comment?
Well,
Thank
obviously
you
you hit a chord. That's why we're all fighting over the mic here to get a chance to tell you about our unintended consequence. But I think it's so important. And for me, it comes conceptually under the notion of generalizability. And again, I think at least the science I was trained in, and I think most of us, is to narrow down and drill or get as specific as you can, both an outcome, a program, and a measure. But there's a danger, as you've articulated and others have here better than I would. So I like to use a strategy of going both specific to targeting exactly what I wanted, but then also broad to look at other potential factors. And just a quick example is, so let's say like you're working on medication adherence. Well, that's great, and there are a number of good multi-method and some, EHR data and stuff you can use, but also I like to really use a quality of life measure to see the impact. Maybe they took the medication, but they feel horrible, or they stopped exercising or doing something like that.
Thank you. Well, we ran out of time, so I'm so sorry. Perhaps you can reach out to the panelists after, during break or during the reception, but thank you so much. This was great. I really appreciate it.